Hello. We've all seen those viral videos, the ones where a passenger throws a tantrum on a plane, yelling at the flight crew, refusing to follow the rules. But what happens when that entitled passenger isn't just rude, but a ruthless bully? What happens when their target is an innocent young woman just trying to get home? Today, we're going to tell you the story of a flight that went from ordinary to unbelievable. It's a tale of a power trip gone wrong, a moment of pure cruelty witnessed by a cabin full of strangers, and a twist so shocking it sounds like it came straight out of a movie script. Because in this story, a flight attendant thought she was kicking a nobody off the plane. She had no idea the person she was trying to impress, a cold and calculating billionaire, was actually about to turn her world upside down. So, what really happened at 30,000 feet, and how did a simple act of bullying lead to an epic reversal of fortune? Before we dive into this wild story, if you're as fascinated by these real-life, jaw-dropping dramas as I am, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with a friend. It's how we keep bringing these incredible true stories to light. The low hum of the engines was a familiar lullaby, and the cabin lights were dimmed to a gentle glow. It was a routine transcontinental flight, the kind where most passengers are already half asleep or lost in their movies. In the front of the plane, in the coveted first-class cabin, sat our three central characters, each in their own world, completely unaware that their paths were about to collide in spectacular fashion. First, there was Amelia. She was a young woman in her early 20s, a recent college graduate traveling on a ticket her grandparents had gifted her. She was a bundle of nervous energy and wide-eyed excitement, her nose buried in a book, occasionally glancing up to take in the sheer luxury of her surroundings. For her, this wasn't just a flight, it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, a small taste of a world she had only ever seen in magazines. Across the aisle sat a woman who was the polar opposite of Amelia. Let's call her Veronica. She was in her late 40s, dressed in an impeccably tailored business suit that looked both expensive and unforgiving. Her face was a mask of cold indifference, her eyes scanning the cabin with a practiced predatory gaze. You could tell just by looking at her that she was a woman of immense power, someone who was used to getting her way without having to ask. She saw the world not as a place of shared humanity, but as a ladder to be climbed, with people like Amelia simply as obstacles or tools. Hovering between them was Sarah, a veteran flight attendant. Sarah had a warm, professional demeanor, the kind that can de-escalate a tense situation with a simple smile. She was good at her job and took immense pride in providing exceptional service. What she didn't know was that her desire to impress the elite in first class would soon lead her to make the biggest mistake of her career. Sarah saw Veronica not as just a passenger, but as a potential connection, a high-value customer whose good favor could mean a world of difference for her career. The conflict began with something as simple as a luggage mix-up. Amelia, a little flustered and new to the world of first-class travel, had accidentally placed her small carry-on bag in a storage space that was apparently considered Veronica's private domain. It was an honest mistake, easily remedied, but to Veronica it was an unforgivable offense, an act of disrespect. She didn't just want her space back. She wanted to make an example of Amelia. She wanted to assert her dominance, to remind this little girl that some people are simply not meant to occupy the same space as her. Veronica didn't say a word to Amelia. Instead, she gestured curtly to Sarah, her eyes burning with an unspoken demand. Sarah, ever attentive, rushed to her side, a polite smile plastered on her face. As Veronica explained the perceived transgression, her voice was a low, cutting whisper, filled with a venom that was far out of proportion to the offense. She didn't just want the bag moved, she wanted the owner of the bag reprimanded, publicly. She wanted to see fear in Amelia's eyes, a confirmation of her own superior status. And that's when Sarah made her fateful decision. Instead of de-escalating, she saw an opportunity to prove her loyalty and efficiency to a passenger who clearly held a great deal of power. In her mind, pleasing the important passenger was paramount. She turned to Amelia, her smile gone, replaced by a stern, professional frown. She spoke with a tone that was cold and dismissive, instructing Amelia to move her bag immediately and, as an aside, to be more mindful of others' space. Amelia, completely taken aback and embarrassed, quickly complied, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She had no idea how this simple interaction was about to spiral into a full-blown crisis. To understand why a simple luggage mix-up was enough to trigger such a cruel reaction, we have to look past the first-class cabin and into the mind of Veronica. Her story isn't one of a rags-to-riches triumph. It's a tale of generational wealth, of a life lived in a gilded cage where the word "knock" was something she only ever said, never heard. Born into a family that owned a sprawling empire of hotels and luxury resorts, Veronica was taught from a young age that the world revolved around her. The phrase, "the customer is always right," wasn't a business motto for her. It was a personal philosophy. Her childhood was an endless series of demands met without question. A new pony? It was delivered. A vacation to a private island? The plane was chartered. There were no boundaries, no consequences for her actions. This upbringing forged a mindset where empathy was a weakness and power was the only currency that mattered. She saw people not as individuals, but as service providers, as obstacles, or as stepping stones. The young Amelia was nothing more than a glitch in her perfectly ordered universe, a nuisance to be dealt with and swiftly forgotten. By the time she inherited the family business, Veronica had perfected this cold, transactional view of the world. She expanded the company with a ruthless efficiency, cutting costs by any means necessary and earning a reputation as a shrewd and heartless negotiator. Competitors weren't just rivals, they were targets to be dismantled. Employees were not people, but cogs in a machine. This wasn't just how she did business, it was how she lived her life. Every interaction was an opportunity to exert control, to prove her dominance. Her behavior on the plane wasn't an outburst, it was a routine. She had been on a business trip, having just finalized a deal that would absorb a smaller, family-owned hotel chain, a deal she had engineered to be as financially devastating for the owners as possible. She felt a surge of satisfaction not just from the profit, but from the sheer display of power. She was in a good mood, a dangerous kind of good mood, one that meant she was looking for a new target, a new way to remind herself of her own untouchable status. So, when she saw Amelia's small, unassuming bag in what she considered her space, it wasn't just a physical inconvenience, it was a symbolic one. It was a challenge to her authority, a small act of defiance from someone who didn't even know they were challenging her. And to Veronica, every challenge, no matter how small, had to be met with a swift and disproportionate response. It was a rule she had lived by her entire life, a rule that had made her a billionaire. The flight attendant, Sarah, played right into her hands. Sarah's eagerness to please, her desire to prove her worth, was a vulnerability that Veronica could spot a mile away. Veronica had seen it 1,000 times in 1,000 different employees, and she knew exactly how to exploit it. All she had to do was apply a little pressure, a silent command, and watch as Sarah did the dirty work for her. She was a puppet master, and Sarah was a willing puppet. Little did either of them know that there was a witness to all of this, someone who had seen it all before, and they were about to step in. With the initial confrontation settled, or so Amelia thought, a tense quiet fell over the first-class cabin. Amelia, her face still hot with shame, kept her eyes glued to her book, trying to disappear into the pages. Sarah, the flight attendant, felt a surge of professional pride. She had handled the situation swiftly and decisively, and she could feel the approving, if cold, gaze of Veronica on her. In Sarah's mind, this was a win. She had proven her worth to a very powerful person, and in her career, that kind of connection was everything. But Veronica wasn't finished. The simple act of having Amelia move her bag wasn't enough to satisfy her need for control. She had seen the humiliation in Amelia's eyes, but she wanted to inflict a greater wound. She wanted to deliver a final, crushing blow. She signaled for Sarah again, a simple, elegant wave of her hand. This time, her voice was even lower, a chilling whisper that held a command so outrageous it should have been immediately dismissed. "I don't want her on this flight," Veronica said, her eyes never leaving Amelia. "Her presence is disruptive. I find it unacceptable." Sarah's professional demeanor faltered for a moment. This was a request far beyond the scope of a passenger complaint. Removing someone from a flight was a serious matter, one that required legitimate cause, not a billionaire's whim. She knew this was wrong. She knew Amelia had done nothing to warrant such a punishment. But a glance at Veronica's stony expression and the memory of the cold, dismissive look she had given her earlier made a decision for her. The thought of disappointing this high-powered passenger, of losing this golden opportunity, was more terrifying than the thought of doing the right thing. Ignoring the small gnawing voice of her conscience, Sarah straightened her shoulders. She turned back to Amelia, her face a mask of official authority. "Ma'am," she began, her voice formal and chillingly detached, "I'm going to have to ask you to collect your things. You'll be disembarking the plane. Amelia S. head shot up, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What? Why?" she stammered, the words barely audible. I didn't do anything." Her humiliation was now replaced by pure terror. This wasn't just an embarrassing moment anymore. It was a crisis. She was stranded, thousands of miles from home with no explanation and no one to help. The first-class cabin, once a tranquil space, was now filled with a palpable, horrifying tension. Other passengers began to stir, their movie screens forgotten. They had seen the entire interaction, the cruel demands from Veronica, the sycophantic obedience of Sarah, and now this, a young, innocent woman being unjustly thrown off a flight. Whispers broke out, a low murmur of disbelief and outrage. But no one spoke up. The sheer weight of Veronica's presence, the blatant power she held, kept them silent. Sarah, deaf to the whispers and blind to the injustice, was focused only on her task. She motioned for another crew member to assist her, and together they began to move towards Amelia, their movements cold and deliberate. The humiliation for Amelia was complete. She had no choice but to stand up, her hands trembling as she grabbed her small carry-on bag. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of a profound, helpless frustration. She was a victim of a system she didn't even know existed, a system where power could bend the rules of reality on a whim. She was a nobody in a world of somebodies, and this was her brutal, unforgettable lesson. But as she took her first step towards the aisle, a voice cut through the tense silence. It was a calm, clear voice that seemed to command attention, a voice that belonged to someone who had also been watching the entire spectacle from a quiet corner of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it had a weight to it that made everyone turn. The person spoke to Veronica, and their words would change everything. The voice that cut through the tension wasn't loud, but it was authoritative. It belonged to a woman in the back of the first-class cabin, someone who had been sitting quietly, seemingly unnoticed, for the entire flight. She was dressed simply, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she held a tablet in her hands. To the casual observer, she looked like any other weary business traveler, but the moment she spoke, the cabin's collective gasp was a testament to the weight of her words. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice even. "This young woman has done nothing wrong. You are the one being disruptive." Veronica turned, her face a mask of shock and fury. Who was this person? How dare she interrupt? How dare she challenge her? "Excuse me," Veronica sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Do you have any idea who I am? I will have you removed from this flight as well. Flight attendant, do your job and get this woman off my plane." But Sarah, the flight attendant, froze. She had never seen a passenger talk to Veronica like that, and for the first time, Her blind ambition was pierced by a flicker of doubt. The woman who had spoken was not a nobody. She was someone who carried herself with a quiet, undeniable power. She wasn't shouting or demanding, she was simply stating a fact, and in her confidence there was an unmistakable authority that even Veronica's bluster couldn't match. The quiet woman stood, her movements deliberate and calm. She walked past the now paralyzed Sarah, her eyes fixed on Veronica. "I know exactly who you are, Miss Sterling," she said, using Veronica's full name, "and I know what you've done. I've been watching you for the past 3 days. I was the one you forced out of that hotel deal in Singapore. My company lost millions, and my people lost their jobs because of your ruthless tactics." She looked at Veronica with a level, unwavering gaze. "You think you can treat people this way because you've always had power." The entire cabin was now completely silent, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. Veronica's face went from fury to a pale, disbelieving shock. This was the woman she had outmaneuvered, the rival CEO she had publicly humiliated in the press just days ago. But how? How was she here, on this flight, and what did she have to do with anything? The quiet woman then turned her attention to the flight attendant, Sarah, who was trembling, finally realizing the full, horrifying scope of her misjudgment. "And you," the woman said, her voice firm but not unkind, "you were so quick to follow her orders, so desperate to impress someone you thought was important, that you were willing to sacrifice your own integrity. You were willing to throw an innocent passenger off the plane." Then came the final, devastating blow, the one that would turn the entire power dynamic on its head. The quiet woman reached into her bag, pulled out a small, unassuming badge and held it up for everyone to see. It was a corporate ID card, and on it was her face and a title that sent a ripple of collective shock through the cabin. The flight attendant's name was Sarah Wilson. The flight was on Ether Airlines. The ID read, "Serena Vance, CEO, Ether Airlines." The plane was not Veronica's. It was Serena's. And the person she was trying to impress was the very person whose trust she had just utterly betrayed. Serena Vance, the billionaire who owned the airline, had been sitting quietly in her own first-class cabin, a silent witness to a moment of pure cruelty. And now she was stepping in to deliver a form of justice that was swift, public, and absolutely final. The silence that followed Serena Vance's revelation was unlike anything that had ever settled over a commercial airliner. It was a stunned, complete quiet, as if the very air had been sucked out of the cabin. Sarah, the flight attendant, stood frozen, her face pale with the dawning horror of what she had done. Her desperate attempt to impress a powerful passenger had just spectacularly backfired, revealing her to be a sycophant in the eyes of the one person who mattered most, her actual boss, the CEO of the entire airline. Veronica, for her part, was also speechless, but for a different reason. Her entire worldview had just been shattered. The woman she had so easily crushed in a business deal, the rival she had dismissed as a lesser competitor, was now standing before her with an authority she could not argue with. The power she wielded so effortlessly on the ground meant nothing at 30,000 feet, where she was just a passenger in someone else's kingdom. The shock was so profound that all her bluster and arrogance evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. But for the rest of the passengers, the mood was one of cathartic relief and a sort of collective awe. The bully had been called out, the victim was being defended, and it was all being done by the owner of the very airline they were flying on. A few quiet claps broke the silence, followed by a low murmur of approval. The tension that had held them hostage for the last hour finally broke, and a sense of justice, swift and unexpected, washed over the cabin. Serena, however, was not seeking applause. Her expression remained calm and professional, her focus squarely on the problem at hand. She turned to Sarah, her voice firm. "Sarah, your priorities were misplaced. You know our company's policy is to protect all passengers, not to cater to the whims of the few at the expense of the many. What you did was an abuse of your position and a violation of our values." She didn't yell or lecture. She simply stated the facts, and that was far more devastating than any angry tirade. Right, single quote, right, single quote. "You will be escorted off this plane at our next available landing for a full review of your conduct." Sarah could only nod, her eyes filled with tears of shame and a sinking realization that her career was likely over. The very thing she had tried so hard to protect, her job and her reputation, was now gone, all because of a single, terrible decision. Serena then turned to Amelia, her expression softening. "Please, ma'am, take your seat. I am deeply sorry for what you have experienced today. We will do everything we can to make this right." She had a flight attendant bring Amelia a glass of water and a warm blanket, a small gesture of humanity that felt monumental after the cruelty she had just endured. Finally, Serena's gaze fell on Veronica, whose face was a study in pure, unadulterated shock. "As for you, Miss Sterling," Serena said, her voice now a cold, steel-like whisper, "I will ensure that you are no longer welcome on any of our flights. And when we land, my team will be in touch with yours regarding our future business dealings." It was a quiet, almost understated threat, but it carried the weight of a powerful corporation. Veronica's world had just come crashing down, and she knew, in that terrifying moment, that this was just the beginning. The cabin was now a transformed space. The power had shifted completely. Veronica, once the untouchable queen of the flight, now sat in silent, seething defeat. Amelia, who had been moments from being stranded, was now being treated with the utmost care. And Sarah, the ambitious flight attendant, was now facing the grim reality of her actions. The flight, once a routine journey, had become a living lesson in justice and consequence. The question now was what would happen next. Would this be the end of the story, or was there more to come for all three of them? The story of the flight wasn't over when the plane landed. For the three women at the center of the drama, the true consequences were just beginning. The moment the aircraft doors opened, Sarah, the flight attendant, was met by a supervisor and a representative from the airline's HR department. Her future was decided swiftly and without fanfare. Her actions were a clear violation of company policy, a fundamental betrayal of trust. She was terminated on the spot. Sarah's career, her ambition, and her trust in the transactional nature of power had been completely undone by a single, self-serving choice. She was left to face the full weight of her decision alone. For Veronica, the reckoning was equally brutal, if more private. The moment she stepped off the plane, her phone buzzed with frantic messages from her legal and PR teams. The news of Serena Vance's presence on the flight had already leaked, and the story was a wildfire, spreading through corporate circles and the media. Her reputation as a ruthless businesswoman had been publicly validated in the worst possible way. What she didn't know was that Serena had already begun to mobilize her team to not only sever all business ties, but to ensure that Veronica's behavior became a well-known liability in the industry. The business world, as cold as it is, still runs on reputation, and Veronica's was now severely tarnished. Her life of entitlement had finally hit a very expensive wall. But what of Amelia, the young woman who had been moments away from being stranded? She was the unexpected beneficiary of this entire bizarre ordeal. As she gathered her belongings, she was approached by Serena, who offered a sincere and profound apology on behalf of her airline. Serena didn't just offer her a refund, she offered her a job. Serena had been impressed by Amelia's quiet resilience and dignity in the face of such a public humiliation. She saw in Amelia a kind of strength that couldn't be bought or taught. And so, a few weeks later, Amelia began an internship at the airline's corporate headquarters, a new path opened to her by the very ordeal that should have crushed her. This wasn't just a simple reversal of fortune. It was a testament to the fact that true power isn't about control or dominance. It's about how you choose to use it. Serena Vance, a woman who had just lost millions to Veronica in a business deal, could have walked off that plane with a bitter taste in her mouth. She could have let the flight attendant's sycophancy go, seen it as a small, insignificant part of a ruthless world. But she didn't. She chose to use her power to do what was right, to correct a profound injustice, and to lift someone up from a moment of despair. The story of the flight is a modern-day fable, one that reminds us that even in our most isolated moments, we are all connected. The actions of one person, whether out of malice or misplaced ambition, can have a ripple effect that touches everyone. And the choice to do the right thing, to stand up for someone, can change not just one life, but many. The viral videos of passengers behaving badly on planes will continue to surface. But this story, the one that went unseen by the public, offers a deeper, more profound message. It teaches us that true authority doesn't come from a title or a bank account. It comes from character. And in the end, it was not the billionaire who was kicked off the plane, but the person who believed she had the right to kick others off. And that, in itself, is the most satisfying kind of justice there is.